Bonjour, everyone. My name is Keirnan LaMarche. I am a senior principal scientist at Thermo Fisher in our CM group. And today I'm going to be talking about some of the way we're using models in part of our control strategy. So we actually have several things we want to talk about. I want to give you a little overview of Thermo Fisher and our CM program there. I want to talk to you about our direct blend encapsulation process and how we run it, and talk to you a bit about, again, our models and how they're part of our control strategy. So Thermo Fisher Scientific, formerly Patheon, is a CDMO for pharmaceuticals. We're one of the largest. We began our continuous manufacturing program in 2014, and we're on track to become the first CDMO filed with a continuous process for direct blend encapsulation line. What we're trying to do at Thermo Fisher is build a highly flexible, modular, continuous system. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. All right, there we go. One last thing. We're doing this all at our continuous manufacturing site in Greenville, North Carolina. So why are we so interested in a highly flexible modular line? Because we're a CDMO, we expect to have a lot of different customers come in with very different projects, very different needs. We want to be able to meet their needs in a flexible and efficient manner. We also want to be able to react to changes in development. It's not uncommon for a drug in development stage to go through a change in drug load. So, for example, you could be at a 10% drug load and then suddenly be at a 50% drug load. We need to be able to react to that in an efficient way to make sure we can hit our timelines. So we want to be able to take different pieces of our equipment and plug them together in different ways to meet our clients' needs. We want to do this all in the same manufacturing space. So in our system, we have things like our feeder and blender system as a unit. We have our tablet presses and encapsulator, our granulation systems. We have both high shear granulation and drying and dry granulation available. And we can take them, break them apart, move the pieces around, put them together again. And that's difficult or challenging, I would say, not only from an equipment point of view, but also from a control strategy point of view. We need to be able to take our control strategy and have it be flexible enough to handle those changes in the equipment. But our first thing we're really working on is getting this continuous encapsulation line up and running for our client. We are also working with a lot of different PAT capabilities. So we have both NIR and Raman available, but we're also using real-time process models in a sort of PAT context. But first, let's talk about the direct blend encapsulation line. So why capsules? Not only is this something our clients are interested in, but this is a product that is used frequently. Many products start off as capsules in early development. They can be better for pediatric formulations. Patients can take them, open them up, and deposit the drugs into something the children will eat. Some patient populations just prefer them. So they are the second most popular form of OSD on the market, and something that our client that we're working with was very interested in making it a continuous line. The issue here is that they're a bit more complex than traditional tableting. The machines have to handle the individual capsules and fill them, and that can mean there's a lot more to go on dynamically with the systems, which poses a challenge for a continuous system. So some design considerations when working with an encapsulator. First thing is mass throughput. The throughput is simply the total amount of material that's flowing through your line, or the total rate at which the material flows through your line. And the minimum capacity of a line is usually set by the capability of your feeders. So for your minor components, you are going to want to have them fed in a controlled manner. And the slower you end up running your feeders, the less data they're getting on the scale over time. So you end up just sprinkling your minor components in at slow rates. That means your feeders are going to be less accurate. So you really want to have a fast enough throughput that you can keep your feeders in the right range. So rule of thumb, you're talking about 15 kilograms an hour right now as being kind of the minimum throughput you want to look at for a line. The other issue here, so you set a minimum throughput you can run. The capsules tend to have a much lower fill weight than a typical tablet. So tablets will be something like 400 milligrams. Capsules are closer to 50 to 100. In that case, you're talking about if you have a smaller unit, you need more units to make the same mass flow rate. So that means a relatively small tablet press, 18 stations, will have a similar throughput to a very, very large encapsulator with something like 200,000 capsules an hour. So 2,100 capsule an hour encapsulator is about the biggest you can find on the market right now. So we need to go from a relatively small tablet press to meet our line needs to a very, very large encapsulator just because of the difference in the weight of the units. So we've got ourselves a very large encapsulator. It's got a range of 100,000 to 200,000 caps an hour. It's a dosator style encapsulator, so it's using dosators to pick up the powder and deposit them into the capsules. It's got a built-in capacitance weight sensor system. So this is a very important part for capsules. Typically, encapsulated products have to go through a separate weight checking step. So they'll take the high weight capsules, low weight capsules, and divert them. That can be difficult from a continuous line. That means another piece of equipment to be incorporated in the line. If that can be incorporated into the encapsulator itself, it does make things a lot simpler. The way this unit makes so many capsules an hour is as 2 turrets of dosators that are running in parallel to create all the capsules. But because it's such a large piece of equipment, it has a large internal holdup, or just the total amount of mass that's held in the system is quite large. But let's look a little bit at how powder flows through the system. So powder comes in through the top. It goes into this large hopper at the top, circled in red. The powder flows from there through 2 screws, then into bowls, and the bowls are where the dosators dive into the powder, pick up the powder, and then put it into the capsules. So this is a schematic of what that looks like. So you can see the geometry of the top hopper. It looks a little bit like a top hat. Powder fills that top hat to a certain flow, goes out of these little ports on the side into the screws that take them down to the bowls. So this machine here, it can hold an enormous amount of powder compared to our normal direct blend tableting line. So we're talking about 3 to 8 kilograms for the common hopper. The bowls are smaller, about 1.5 kilograms each. So you can have as much as 14 kilograms in this one piece of machine. To put that in perspective, a direct tableting line can have about 3, maybe 5 kilograms in the entire line. So this is just one piece of equipment that's several times larger than that. And that has an impact on how the whole machine operates. So when you have a larger amount of material in your line, it's going to respond slower to a given change. One way to test the line is to look at the RTD, or the residence time of material inside of it. A simple test to do that is called a step change experiment. So here we take the feeders, we change their set point from a steady 20% drug load to a 30% drug load, and watch the amount of time for that change to happen inside the system. Because there's so much material inside the line, it takes time for that material to be replaced by the new drug coming in. And when the new drug is totally replaced everything else that's inside of it, that's when you reach your new steady state. So you can see here we have 35 minutes to 40 minutes worth of time to change that system over with. So that's a very long time compared to a direct blend line, which is closer to 5 minutes. So you can have a long transition time, and that can be difficult for control because things will take a long time to travel through your entire system. It also means that you have to deal with potentially large deviations in how much the material has to be rejected by the system. So some other considerations, shell handling issues can be frequent. So the encapsulator has to take shells, the empty shells, open them up, orient them, fill them, close them again, and bring them outside of the machine. That can be difficult if anything happens to those capsule shells. If any of them are crushed in shipping and they come into the machine, they can start causing problems. That means the machine will either slow down or stop because of the issues. And a continuous line having frequent stops can be difficult from a controls perspective. You really want to keep everything running at a nice steady rate. The large holdup also makes disturbance rejection difficult. So if you have a continuous line and you have feeders that occasionally will have an issue, you want to be able to reject material that is at the wrong concentration for your control system. For a large line, that means we can have a very long rejection time. So if a feeder step out, because the system responds so slowly, it can be a long time for that material to leave. So this is true for any large piece of equipment, dryers, coaters, example. We use process models here as a potential solution for that issue. So let's talk a little bit about real-time process models as PAT tools. So what's a process model? Here we're using mass balance systems to make predictions of how the concentration changes within the system. And this is similar to residence time distributions, which you've heard about before. We'll talk a little bit about those in a second. So as CM becomes more integrated in pharmaceutical processes, these sort of models become more important for the design and operation of our systems. What we're doing here is trying to build a PAT approach to how we use these models. So we make real-time predictions of the concentration. We can make inferences about what the concentration is, and this can give us an idea of the internal state of the system throughout our process line. So this offers challenges offers the ability to understand changes in our system over time, and we can look at how the process varies in real time. For challenging process like encapsulation, this allows us to integrate all that data into one sort of system for understanding what's happening. So first thing, are models really a PAT system? And that's definitely the case. Typically, when we think about PAT, we usually think about process analytical chemistry tools, NIR, Raman. However, there's many other forms of PAT. In the definition, there's several different areas which can be explained as being PAT tools. That includes mathematical tools. So mathematical tools and models are definitely part of the PAT paradigm. And the goal of our modeling program is really to make use of that process data that we're getting from different parts of our system and get a prediction of how the concentration changes with time. So we talked a little bit about residence time distribution. I just want to go over this very quickly. Residence time distribution is a very important concept for continuous manufacturing. It's a result of a simple mass balance calculation. And what we're looking at is the ability to characterize the system in a very particular way. So we're looking at how long it takes material to travel through the continuous system. And basically, not just how long it takes, but the distribution of times. So if I take a certain amount of material and add it to my line, in a system with mixing, you're going to find that some material comes through fast, some material comes through slower, just because it ends up mixing in different places of the line, and it takes a different sort of random walk through the process. By characterizing this, you get a good idea of how much mixing you're happening. More mixing means it takes a broader amount of time, or if you have a broader distribution of times, the material will leave the system. So this is a very important characterization tool of a process. And it's very much tied to the mechanical operation of your process. So this is a very important process, and you can look at this at steady state and have a good idea of how your system's behaving and if things have changed. Where does this come from? So it comes from mass balances. Nice thing about mass is that it's conserved. That means that whatever you put into the system minus whatever comes out of the system is what's accumulating in the system. So it's really just that simple as the basis of these models. If we add in a little bit of assumptions about how material is behaving inside the system, for example, we assume things are well mixed, we end up with a continuously stirred tank reactor model. This is an idealized sort of behavior of a system. It comes from the chemical industry. It's been used for about 100 years now. And it's a great way of looking at a particular type of mixing inside a system. So you ignore a lot of the dynamics. You say, okay, this is an idealized mixing unit in my system. The other basic component of these sort of models is called a plug flow reactor. This comes from the idea that you can have a system like a pipe where material comes in, it stays inside the pipe with no mixing, and then eventually comes out again. So this acts like a delay. So a signal comes into a plug flow reactor, it remains in place, it doesn't change, and then eventually comes out a delayed time later. And it turns out to really understand a entire continuous process, you really need these two assumptions that you can combine together. So let's take an example of that. Let's say I have a particular unit that's more complicated than just mixing perfectly. How do I deal with that? How do I model that? What you do is you take two different CSTR models and you combine them together to get the sort of dynamics you're looking for. For example, in this case, we're looking at an area where, let's say in our continuous line, we have some material that gets stuck in a corner someplace and it doesn't mix very well, so it comes out slowly. You can model that with two CSTRs that are simply connected together. So you can have the main mixing area where most of the material is, and you can have your area where the mixing is slower, and they talk back and forth to each other. So this can end up changing your residence time distribution to give you a longer curve, a longer tail to your distribution. So by combining these things together, you end up with a more complex looking RTD than you could with just the individual idealized units themselves. And by putting these together, you end up building a very complex set of RTDs about your system. And this is what the chemical industry does for their continuous processes. They'll build these together until they get a good approximation of how their system is working, and they use that to understand the entire continuous process. A great example of this is pharmacokinetics. So this uses the exact same concepts. They use CSTRs to represent different parts of the body and transfers between those different parts of the body that occur. And by using these simple continuous models, you can get a good approximation of what's happening inside the human body over time. So they're very powerful tools. They're used in a lot of different industries, a lot of different scientific applications. And the power really comes from the simplicity, their ability to just be based on this idea of a mass balance model. So how are we using these models? What we're using them for are making real-time predictions. So we're utilizing the real-time data from our feeders. So the feeders are constantly putting material on our system. They're giving us a weight rate that you're running at. So we can see that there. That's the feed rate from one of our feeders. That data is put into our model. It then calculates things in real time and then produces the concentration that's coming out in each of our unit operations over time. So we can see what's happening constantly. The nice thing about these models, or running these models this way, they're not dependent on throughput, so we can have deviations of throughput and still have a good prediction. They're what that means, they're not a representation of residence time. What we're doing here really is combining different data streams, so taking data from our system live and then running it through the models to get a prediction of what's happening and really turning this into a PAT instrument. So a little bit about throughput and RTD. So we said it before that our residence time distribution doesn't actually depend on, or does depend on throughput. You have to have this constant throughput, you have to be at steady state. So this makes sense. A residence time, the amount of time the material spends inside your system, depends on how fast your system is going. If you go slow, you end up with a nice, broad, long distribution. It spends more time inside the line. There's more time for mixing to happen. That means you end up with a broader distribution of times that material can come out. If you go faster, the material will come out quicker. You end up with a shorter, narrower distribution. And this is very important to understand because if you're trying to predict the amount of mixing in your system, you want to have a control over the concentration that comes out the other side. If you start speeding up your line, you'll end up with less and less mixing. So you can end up with a certain point where you're going fast enough that your mixing isn't sufficient to meet your entire line's needs. So this is a way of characterizing your system at a constant throughput. And if you want to change that throughput, you need to actually characterize your system again to make sure you have an understanding of how that changes with the throughput. And this can be, obviously you run most processes at a constant throughput set point. There can be deviations, so it's important to be able to handle those. But also, if you're working with a multi-strength product, where you're making multiple strengths on the same line for the same product, you're probably going to be running at different throughputs for each of those products. And that means that you're going to have a set of RTDs available for understanding your process and controlling them. So having an approach that's independent of throughput for predictions is an important advantage. So here's an example of the constant calculation process. We're seeing a constant throughput. We see a change in the API mass rate. And we're seeing the response to the system. So this is the sort of thing we'd see from our actual system here. The changes happening with time. We're getting second-by-second updates on what the concentration is based on what our feeders are doing. Here's another example where we change throughput. So the feeder goes through the same step. Our concentration starts to change. The throughput of the entire line, so basically all the feeders summed together have slowed down. And that means we have a change in our response. And you can see, compared from one to the next, the difference in the amount of time it takes for that concentration to change. And that's very important for understanding if this sort of thing would occur during a process, you would have to change how you're controlling. But our system's able to take that into account automatically. So what's really the utility of these sort of real-time process models? It gives us a PAT kind of understanding of what's happening. We're utilizing our feeder data to really understand our process and to predict what's happening. We can have an understanding of the long-term health of the system by monitoring these models over time. We can see if there's any changes to the structure of our models or structures of our system. That indicates something's changing and something we want to address. We have a constant evaluation of the product quality, which is what we're really excited about. Now, this makes for diversion more efficient. If let's say there was a disturbance to the process that we want to remove material from the system, we're able to predict the concentration and determine what material needs to be removed and what material can stay very accurately. The other thing we can do here that we can't do with spectroscopic methods typically is we can divert based on all of the feeder data. So in other words, each of the materials we're looking at here, our magnesium stearate, our disintegrant, the API, other materials that may be inside the formulation, we're monitoring each of the feeders and we're making predictions of each of the feeders' concentrations or what the concentration of that material is. If any of them go outside a particular bound, we can reject that material. So typically when you're looking at this from a PAT perspective, you're looking at spectroscopic methods, you're really only analyzing your data from your API. Other critical parts of your system, other critical parts of your formulation may not have the same level of visibility of what's going on. Here's an example of rejection. So we're seeing our feeder data and our model prediction are in agreement. They're right on top of each other. Suddenly we have an issue with a feeder. It's deposited too much material. Our concentration starts to rise. It goes outside some bounds. Rejection starts. It comes back within the bounds. We can wait a slight delay and then start accepting the material again. So over time, we're watching how the concentration changes, and our system's constantly evaluating this relative to our limits and can reject material dynamically if necessary. All right, so how do we build these real-time process models? And there's important thoughts to go into how you want to build these. Really want to focus on how the model structure and parameters are determined. So our goal is really to build an accurate model that represents the physical structure of our lithium line. That's not always necessary. Sometimes you can simplify. There's certain parts of the system that are relatively small, like the mill, that doesn't necessarily have a big impact on the overall performance of the system. However, for us and to help us with our flexibility, we really want all of those different unit operations to be evaluated as part of the model. This really helps us enable our modular approach. So we want the mass input from each feeder. That's a major input for our process model. And step one really is assess each piece of equipment, try to determine what kind of structural model should be in there, and start evaluating the system. So if we look at the different systems here, our blender and our co-mill are both represented well by CSTRs, so single CSTRs is all we need. For our encapsulator, with all the different parts in there, it's much more complex. We need a more complex model to really get the same dynamics. And one thing we started looking at as we evaluated this, we looked at it and said, okay, you have this very large common hopper. It's possible for material to get stuck in there. The exits are really near the edges of the hopper, so material in the sides may not actually get out. So we started looking at whether or not there's a slow mixing zone or a dead zone inside that feeder. And when we did collected our data on our system and analyzed it, we found that yes, the best models for predicting this really said there was a dead zone inside the large common hopper where material was not actually getting out and into the rest of the process. That can be a risk to run with because you have material that's in there for an unknown amount of time. You really want your mixing to be complete. So we've looked at solving this now with different changes to how the system runs and are pretty confident we can remediate that. From there, we refine our model parameters. We get a better prediction over time, and we make sure we can get a good idea of what's happening inside our system. I think I'm losing the microphone again. Sorry, everyone. Okay. How's that? Can everyone hear me? All right. Try number two. Okay, where are we? Oh, so we're looking at how we solve these sort of things. So there's a lot of different considerations taking place when you start actually solving these the systems in your control system. So one thing that's very important is that to get a live prediction, you need to solve ordinary differential equations in real time. There's lots of different ways to do this, but one important factor is that you have to have your control system talk to that prediction. The prediction has to come in the control system so that it can see it and make decisions on whether or not to divert the material. That can have challenges in itself. How does it talk to the system? Can we integrate it into the control system directly? A lot of different decisions need to go into that. What we really want to do here for us was to make sure that we're modeling our physical systems with our models. And this is really important for our modularity. We want to be able to take systems out, let's say remove a mill for a different product. We want our control system to have the modularity to say, okay, that mill's not there anymore, but all our models still work. We don't have to rebuild them for each product we come in. And that has certain complexities with it as well. So what we want to do is program in certain model blocks. So in other words, different combinations of CSTRs and feeders, CSTRs and plug flow reactors that we can get an accurate prediction for different kind of dynamics and different kind of systems. So we can go through a recipe for each of our products and pick out what models we want for each of our unit operations, put them into place, determine the parameters for them, and we can do that for each of the pieces of equipment very flexibly as we change our system for different products. So I want to show a little bit of calibration data here, and talk about some of the interesting aspects of using these sort of models. So what you're seeing here is step changes in API concentration from 40% to 10%. This was micronized APAP, which is a very poorly flowing material, and changing 40% to 10% is a really big change in material properties. However, even though we're making those big changes in concentration, we're able to calibrate our model just fine. And this gives us quite a bit of confidence that we're really looking at changes in the physical holdup of the system. It's not so much dependent on powder properties, just the amount of material that's in the system, as theory would predict. We used NR spectroscopic probes to determine the concentration. We did this in a particular way. We didn't look at building a model. We can actually use normalized PCA scores directly to make this sort of prediction. Process models are very sensitive to the timing of events. So if you look at this and say, okay, what's the timing at which different transitions come through, that's really the most important thing for modeling the system. So we can calibrate our data based just on these dynamics. Another really important part to look at here is the process stops. So you'll see little gaps in the NIR data as this goes through. And what's happening there is our encapsulator is stopping. It's running into a problem with capsule shells handling, has to stop. Someone has to go clean out part of the capsule shells. And that is very important for us because that's A, how the machine is really going to operate, and that means our calibration data set takes that into account. We want to be able to say we're predicting what's happening in a real system in real time. The other nice thing is the model is able to handle that just fine. So the process stops and restarts. We don't really have an issue with how the model behaves. It's very important for us to be able to get that similar behavior when we're actually running. So performance, how are the models operating? So the model represents the concentration well. We have an RMSE of 1.5% of target, so that's a kind of metric for how well the model is predicting the system. So when you get our target concentration predicted to within 1.5%, that compares well with our deviation limits. You can have deviation limits of, let's say, 5%. As long as we're being larger than that, we can actually predict our concentration and then divert the material if necessary. Our model is also very stable. So we have data sets going back to 2017 to 2019. And over that course of time, our process models parameters haven't changed. So our system doesn't change over time. That's very important to understand how your process model is robust to time changes. And this fits well with our understanding as well about being really about the amount of mass inside the system and tied to that physical nature. So as long as the physical nature of your machine doesn't change, your model parameters should also remain pretty stable. So what we want to do next is really look at improving, or talk about improving the startup and shutdown process and dealing with frequent stops of the machine. A lot of the models we've been looking at so far have really been based on a steady state assumption. So we're looking at things that aren't changing with time. It does an adequate job, but for a startup, which can be very long for a process of this size, as well as some of these stops and starts, we really want something that's a little more dynamic, takes into account those facts that we're not necessarily always at steady state. So we use here dynamic mass balance models. We're removing the steady state assumption. For CSDR model blocks, the complexity is not that much larger. So we have a small increase in complexity. The equations are a little bit more complex. We're still solving ordinary differential equations, but overall the jump in complexity is not that hard. We can handle that pretty easily. Plug flow reactors, a little more complex. We'll talk about those in a second. What we're really doing here is allowing yourselves a wider range of control. For a steady state assumption, you need this amount of mass of the system to stay very constant, even as small throughput changes can happen. That means we need to have a small operating range of the amount of material in our common hopper. So we can imagine running a large encapsulator with a lot of material inside a hopper. Material is constantly coming in from our feeders and filling that line, and as long as the encapsulator is on and running, material is leaving that common hopper at the same rate it's coming in, so the level stays nice and constant. The moment something happens in the encapsulator forces it to slow down or stop, the amount of material in that hopper jumps up, and we have to have limits on how far that can move in order to make sure we're maintaining our accuracy of our models. And that means we have a relatively tight range at which we can operate in there, and if you're running very stably for many hours, that's not really a big deal. It's a nice way to run. If you have a encapsulator that has more process stops and starts that can happen unexpectedly, that makes that more difficult to run overall. So we get ourselves a much wider level of control by using these sort of models. The other thing that's a little more complex is you need some kind of measurement of the exit rate. So in order to complete the mass balance, you need another source of data. That's fairly easy to come by in these sort of data-rich environments. You can get your rate at which your encapsulator is running. You can have level measurements that can go into it. You can use a bunch of different measurements to really complete that equation. So let's talk about non-steady plug flow reactors. They're more challenging than CSDRs. The basic problem here is that you end up with a more complex partial differential equation rather than an ordinary differential equation. For a steady state, the solution here is trivial. You end up simply with a delay. So material enters a plug flow reactor, it waits in there with no real mixing, it doesn't change at all, and then eventually comes out the other side after a certain amount of time. So that's all that's happening at steady state. In a dynamic environment, the amount of material inside the plug flow reactor may change, the rate at which it's going may change, so material may come in at a different rate that it's leaving. You end up with a more complex set of dynamics inside the plug flow reactor that you have to take into account now. That really means you have to track the material as it moves through it in an accurate way. This is not especially difficult. Any kind of laptop computer can handle this easily, but it becomes more of a factor when you're thinking about this from a control point of view. You need to complete your solutions, your models, in the amount of time frame for your control system. So your control system operates on a second-by-second basis. You need to start your calculation, complete the calculation, and return the data to the control system all within that 1 second. Definitely doable, but something to think about when you talk about the complexity of these sort of models. Make sure you're getting the right accuracy of your model and the right rate at which it's producing results. I think I have a few more minutes. I just want to talk a little bit about model recovery. This is a really interesting aspect of these sort of models. Typically, when we think about the models, we kind of worry about whether or not bad data it can change the model prediction over time. So in other words, does errors compound to get a more and more inaccurate prediction? And that's true for several models. You can think of trying to measure your distance someplace by measuring how fast you're going, the direction you're going. Any kind of small error tends to compound over time. That is not the case with these sort of models. The nice thing about these models is they're constantly getting data from the feeders. So they're constantly getting new data in, and that can replace old data that's come in. So they tend to recover. So this is very similar to what's happening physically inside the system. As inaccurate data comes in, it packs the calculations and predictions, but that old data is constantly being pushed through the system and out the other side. So you end up with this sort of change in the system prediction and then a recovery to the normal. So you have small errors that occur. Those don't really matter because they'll end up being washed out over time. So as long as your average data coming in is accurate, your models will return their accurate prediction. And you can respond to these inaccuracies in a conservative manner. All right, I'd like to conclude. We're using a modular approach for continuous manufacturing at Thermo Fisher. We're building a continuous encapsulation line for a customer. We think this is a high capability pathway for continuous manufacturing. We're looking at filing next year. We're very excited about that. We're building process models for real-time prediction to use in a PAT sort of method. We think this is a very efficient way of running a large machine like an encapsulator. This is not dependent on constant throughput, so we can have more accuracy over time and a better prediction of what's going on. And we are looking at, or we're using dynamic non-steady models for understanding how something like an encapsulator, which has a more dynamic behavior, works and predicts how our system works. And it makes our startup and shutdown more efficient. All right, I'd like to acknowledge a large number of people, the entire CM team at Thermo Fisher. We have a great team of people. We're working together to build this sort of system. It's been a pleasure to work with them. I've been there for about 1.5 years now, and it's been a great experience. I'd like to say to the audience that we're a CDMO, so we're very open about talking to people about what we work on and how we do things. We have people come by all the time who are interested. We give them tours of our system. We talk to them about what we're going on. So if you're interested in hearing more, please contact me. Stop me. I have cards, but also my email is up here. And stop on by. We'll show you how our continuous line works, and we'll talk to you a lot about your needs and how we can potentially fill them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Keirnan. Excellent presentation. So we have about 10-15 minutes for questions. Yes, Lawrence.
Hi, Keirnan. Nice presentation. Thank you very much. I was wondering, in the graph that you showed, there was no drawing of a reject port after the blender, and you talk about such a big holdup and that making the system slow. So why would you choose not to put a reject port there?
So we really believe in rejecting at the point that you're most interested in. So we're concentration at our capsules are our place where we're really interested in maintaining the accuracy of the model. We have such a large amount of material in the encapsulator, it actually does an enormous amount of mixing in there. So more mixing happens there than anywhere else in the line because it has the most material than anywhere else in the line. So a disturbance that comes through the blender may or may not be really an issue. When it comes into the encapsulator, that's really where most of the mixing can play. So small deviations will all get blended together inside the encapsulator. On top of that, when you reject from a blender, you can always disrupt what's happening. We have as much fun with maintaining the encapsulator at a steady state. By changing the amount of material coming in and out to the encapsulator, that's going to be an extra set of deviations from how the steady state's operating inside the encapsulator. So we believe in trying to get that one point of rejection where the product's being made.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Thanks for nice presentation. So what one should be in consideration while doing such model validation? It's critical things and most important things.
Well, I think there's several critical things to think about. One, you really want to work through all of the different sort of design considerations you have for your models. If you're thinking that you may go through throughput changes, you want to model those in part of your validation. You want to produce data that is as close to how you would actually operate. So if you process will stop and start, you want to make sure that's in there as well. And really show that you're able to control through your actual operations. As long as you have all those factors in there, you should have a really good validation.
Okay. Other questions? Comments? Yes. Go ahead.
I wonder, what's the acceptance from health authorities for the model-based running of the plant? Because I think I can see it from big agencies, but from the smaller ones, there could be some challenges.
Possibly. We talk to our regulators frequently, which is important. We've gone to the ETD and met with the client and with them on many occasions. We showed them the data. We showed them how we're playing our process modeling. Several of these slides actually came from talks that we originally gave to them. So we want to make sure we're communicating to them about how we're planning to do this, how the models really work, how we're validating their behavior, and proving that they have the capability to do what we think they're doing. And we think we've got great feedback from them, and we know what their concerns are and how we can address them. Right now, we're really focused on getting this up and running for our United States market. And then I think as this comes, it'll be like NAR probes or other kinds of PAT methods that are been accepted now by more and more of the world. I think this sort of thing, once it's demonstrated to be really effective, we'll definitely get there.
Okay. Other questions or comments? Once more? Okay. Thank you very much, Keirnan, for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.